Zambezi River, September 2009. A tour guide is stepping into water that looks calm from above but tips over the edge of the world just meters ahead of him. A tourist has slipped past the natural rock lip that keeps swimmers from being pulled over Victoria Falls, and she is being dragged toward the drop. He goes in after her. 90 meters below, the river disappears into the mist of the largest curtain of falling water on the African continent, a mist so thick that from certain viewing platforms the falls themselves are invisible. She survives. He doesn't. His body is never recovered in a way the family can hold. His name never makes international headlines. His fall becomes a footnote in a story that most tourism boards, most tour operators, and most travel guides would prefer nobody ever added up. Because when you add it up, the numbers get uncomfortable. In Bolivia, roughly 300 people die every year on a 43-mile mountain road that tour operators sell as an adventure ride, a road so narrow it hardly gets wider than 10 feet, with a 2,000-foot drop at every turn and crucifixes lining the shoulder as unofficial mile markers. On Mount Everest, the fatality rate for climbers sits at around 6.5%, a figure that would shut down virtually any other paid activity on Earth. In Yosemite alone, 12 to 15 people die each year, part of a national park system where roughly 150 deaths are logged annually. Snakes on a Brazilian island so infested that the government banned civilian visits. A stairway in Hawaii sealed off after a storm and climbed anyway, night after night, by people who pay guides to sneak them past the fences. A pool inches from the edge of Victoria Falls that people queue to swim in and post from. A wooden plank bolted to the side of a Chinese mountain 7,000 feet in the air, walked by pilgrims for centuries and now by tourists for a photograph. Which raises the question this investigation is built around. Why do millions of people year after year willingly pay to place themselves inside attractions that are statistically likely to kill some of them? And why do the countries hosting these attractions, knowing exactly how the numbers look, keep the gates open? This is the story of how thrill became an industry. Of a Norwegian cliff where a young Australian woman fell to her death posing for a photograph on a rock the size of a truck. Of an elephant camp in Thailand shut down by prosecutors after a Chinese tour guide was killed in front of paying customers and 2 more tourists were injured in the same incident. Of a Spanish walkway so decrepit that school children once used it as a shortcut on their way to class. Of a Brazilian island so overrun with golden lancehead vipers that visits require a naval escort and a physician. Of a Mexican cave shaft 1,200 feet deep, so vast that base jumpers with almost no training have died inside holding their own ropes. Of a hike in California so exposed that its own park rangers publicly discourage the public from attempting it. And of a small handful of national park rangers, coroners, mountaineering clubs, and hiking forum veterans who have spent decades quietly documenting a pattern that almost everyone else in the industry seems determined to look past. The facts, statistics, and case details in this episode are drawn from published National Park Incident Reports, coroner records, tourism board bulletins, and international press reporting on each of the sites discussed. Where a claim rests on a specific case, a fall, a drowning, a mauling, it is anchored to reporting that has been on the public record for years. Nothing here is dramatized. The bodies really did land where the numbers say they did. Before we get into any of it, one small piece of context matters. Every one of these attractions has, at some point, been publicly marketed as safe. Bolted, harnessed, guided, licensed, permitted, ranger patrolled, roped off, chaperoned. The word safe in tourism is not a description of risk. It is a description of paperwork. And paperwork, as the families of the dead have found out one by one, does not stop a body from falling 7,000 feet. To understand why the modern tourism industry sells cliffs, volcanoes, and Viper Islands as vacation destinations, you have to go back long before anyone thought of these places as vacations at all. Consider Mount Hua, in the Shaanxi province of central China. Today the mountain is famous mostly for one thing: a set of wooden planks bolted horizontally into the side of a vertical granite face, 7,000 feet above the valley floor, that visitors walk along one at a time while clipped into a thin safety cable. Millions of tourists have queued to do this. Photographs of the plank walk appear in nearly every list of the world's most dangerous hikes ever published. But the plank walk was not built for tourists. It was built for pilgrims more than 700 years ago by Taoist monks who wanted to reach a small shrine at the top of a mountain and who did not have modern climbing gear or safety cable. Falling was the point. Falling meant the mountain had rejected you. Surviving the crossing was a kind of religious credential. That distinction between a dangerous place used by people who accepted the danger as part of a spiritual or practical necessity, and a dangerous place open to strangers arriving by bus with a printed ticket, is at the heart of almost every death this investigation will look at. Because the pilgrims of Mount Hua were not casual visitors. They had walked for days or weeks to arrive at the base of the mountain. They understood in a bone-deep way that the shrine at the top would cost some of them their lives. Their community accepted that cost. There was no tour operator selling them the experience, no travel insurer underwriting the trip, no comment section rating the excursion on a 5-star scale. What changed, roughly starting in the middle of the 20th century, was the arrival of a global middle class with disposable income, cheap air travel, and a growing appetite for what tourism scholars now call experiential consumption. Sightseeing was no longer enough. People wanted to do things. They wanted to climb something, dive somewhere, walk on the edge of something. And a small industry began forming around meeting that demand, first with certified guides in the Alps and the Himalayas, then, as the market expanded, with less certified guides everywhere else. Attractions that had been local secrets became international destinations. Local secrets that had killed 1 or 2 people a decade started killing 1 or 2 people a month. The clearest example of this transition is the Camino del Rey in southern Spain, a narrow catwalk of concrete and steel pinned to the wall of a limestone gorge in the province of Malaga. It was built in the early 1900s as a service walkway for workers moving between 2 hydroelectric plants. Local villagers used it as a shortcut. School children used it to get to class. Nobody thought of it as an attraction. Then, sometime in the second half of the 20th century, sections of the walkway began collapsing. Handrails rotted away. The concrete floor turned into gaps you had to jump across. And that is the point at which rock climbers around the world started arriving. The more decayed the walkway got, the more famous it became. The reputation spread through climbing forums, then through general travel media, and by the early 2000s the Camino del Rey had a name it had never earned during its working life, the most dangerous walkway on Earth. Deaths followed. The regional government eventually closed the original route, poured tens of millions of euros into a new one, and reopened it as a paid attraction with helmets and guides. The old catwalk still hangs beneath the new one, visible from every step. That is roughly the arc every attraction in this episode has followed. A place existed for one reason. A different set of people showed up and started using it for another. And somewhere in the gap between those two uses, the death toll became the marketing. There is a specific version of this arc that runs through the American National Park System, and it is worth pausing on because it explains a lot about how modern tourism treats risk in general. When the United States created its first national parks in the late 1800s, the founding logic was preservation, not recreation. The idea was to protect landscapes from being logged, mined, or subdivided into ranches visitors were welcome, but they were incidental. That began to shift in the 1920s and 30s when the National Park Service, under pressure to justify its budget to Congress, began actively marketing the parks as vacation destinations, building roads, lodges, and viewing platforms designed to make wilderness accessible to the average American family driving a car. Attendance exploded. So did the death toll. Today, the Park Service estimates that roughly 150 visitors die inside America's national parks every year, out of somewhere north of 300 million annual visits. Statistically, that is a very small number relative to attendance. It is also, and this is the point, a number the Park Service has learned to talk about in a very specific way. The public messaging emphasizes the denominator. The fatality numbers are placed inside a ratio that makes them sound almost invisible. And that framing is not wrong exactly, but it is a choice. Because when you look at where those 150 deaths actually happen, they cluster. Grand Canyon National Park alone accounts for somewhere between 15 and 20 of them per year, along with roughly 300 search and rescue incidents. Yosemite adds another 12 to 15. The Hawaiian volcanoes account for a smaller but rising number as the Kilauea system continues cycling in and out of active eruption. The Precipice Trail in Acadia on the coast of Maine had its first fatality in nearly 3 decades in 2012 when a woman fell from an exposed section of the route. The Park Service continues to publicly discourage hikers from taking that trail downhill. Many hikers continue to do so anyway. The pattern that emerges from any honest read of Park Service incident data is this: a very small number of specific attractions inside the American park system are responsible for a very large percentage of the deaths. Everyone in the Park Service knows which attractions those are. Everyone in the surrounding tourism industry knows too. And yet the messaging around those attractions almost never uses the word dangerous. It uses words like challenging, strenuous, exposed, advanced. The vocabulary is calibrated to protect the visitor experience, not the visitor. Because if the signage at the trailhead of the precipice actually said this trail has killed people who thought they could handle it, a non-trivial number of people would turn around, and turning around is bad for the local economy. Quick pause here. If this kind of reporting, the pattern behind the headline, the incentives nobody in the industry wants to say out loud, is the kind of thing you want more of, the single most useful thing you can do right now is hit the like button. It costs you nothing, and it tells the platform to push this investigation to other people who would want to watch it. That is genuinely all it does. And that is genuinely how a channel like this one survives. Back to the parks. What is quietly interesting is that the same pattern of soft language marketing masking hard fatality data is not confined to the United States. In Norway, Trolltunga, the enormous tongue-shaped rock formation projecting horizontally out of a cliff above Lake Ringedalsvatnet, was for decades a local hiking destination visited by a few hundred people a year. It became internationally famous in the early 2010s, largely through Instagram. Within a few seasons, annual visitation had jumped into the tens of thousands, then hundreds of thousands. The Norwegian Tourism Board's official language kept describing it as a demanding hike suitable for experienced walkers. In practice, thousands of the new arrivals were casual tourists in sneakers, phones out, edging toward the tip of the rock to pose. In 2015, a 24-year-old Australian woman lost her footing near the edge of the formation and fell to her death. She is the case the international press cites when they cite anyone at all. She is not the only fatality Trolltunga has produced. If you strip away the marketing and the postcard photographs, the attractions in this investigation kill people through a fairly narrow set of physical mechanisms. Understanding those mechanisms is what separates a place that is genuinely dangerous from a place that merely looks dangerous. And the first mechanism, the one that appears more often than any other in coroner reports from these sites, is water at speed. Consider Devil's Pool at the crest of Victoria Falls. Devil's Pool is a naturally formed rock basin on the Zambian side of the falls, on the crest of the Zambezi River, right at the tipping point where the water begins its 90-meter drop. During the dry season, when the river is low, a submerged rock lip at the outer edge of the pool creates a natural barrier that keeps swimmers from being pulled over. Tour guides bring paying visitors out to the pool, one small group at a time, and let them swim right up to the edge. Photographs from Devil's Pool are among the most shared images on the entire African tourism circuit. What the photographs do not show is that the rock lip is not a wall. It is at most a shallow ridge. The current on the Zambian side of the falls, even in the driest month, is moving with enough force that a swimmer who slips past that ridge is not swimming anymore. They are falling. This is the exact circumstance that killed the tour guide who opened this episode in September of 2009. He was not being reckless. He was doing his job. He went in after a tourist who had slipped, and the current took both of them. She was pulled back. He was not. Water at speed is also what makes Jacob's Well in Central Texas one of the deadliest recreational dive sites in North America. Jacob's Well is an artesian spring, a freshwater cave system that begins as a modest pool at the surface and then narrows through a series of underwater chambers down to more than 120 feet. At least 9 divers are known to have died inside it. The third chamber, roughly 80 feet below the surface, contains a feature that experienced cave divers refer to as the false exit, a narrow, upward slanting passage that looks, in the dim beam of a headlamp, like the way out. It is not. The real exit is elsewhere. Divers who take the false exit find themselves wedging deeper into the rock rather than closer to the surface, and the geometry of the passage makes turning around inside it almost impossible. The fourth chamber, deeper still, contains a squeeze so tight that divers have to remove their tanks to pass through. That squeeze has killed people too. Then there is the second physical mechanism that appears constantly in these reports, which is altitude. Not the drop itself exactly, but the biology of what happens to a human body above certain elevations. On Mount Everest, the accepted climber fatality rate is around 6.5%. That figure has been remarkably stable across decades. What kills climbers on Everest is only occasionally an avalanche or a crevasse fall. Most of the fatalities in the death zone reports involve altitude sickness, cerebral edema, pulmonary edema, the specific cascade of physiological failures that occurs when a body is deprived of adequate oxygen for long enough. A climber who is moving normally can, within the span of 2 or 3 hours, lose the ability to walk in a straight line, then the ability to make coherent decisions, then consciousness. Guides on the mountain describe watching this happen. They describe the moment when a client stops responding to their name. And then there is temperature, which is what makes Death Valley one of the most quietly lethal tourist destinations in the American West. Death Valley holds the record for the highest air temperature ever reliably recorded on the surface of the Earth, 134 degrees Fahrenheit, or 57 degrees Celsius, logged at Furnace Creek in 1913. In summer, surface temperatures well above 120 are routine. The Park Service posts warnings at every trailhead. The warnings are ignored constantly. A visitor without water in July, in the low elevations of the valley floor, will survive for hours, not days. Multiple recent fatalities involve tourists who parked their rental car, walked a short distance for a photograph, and could not make it back. The next set of mechanisms is biological. Snake Island, off the coast of São Paulo state in Brazil, is technically a small island called Ilha de Queimada Grande, and is the only known habitat on Earth for a specific species of pit viper called the golden lancehead. When rising sea levels cut the island off from the mainland several thousand years ago, the viper population that ended up trapped there evolved in near total isolation. With no ground mammals to prey on, they adapted to feed almost exclusively on migratory birds, and their venom, over generations of natural selection, became extraordinarily fast-acting, because a bird that flies away after being bitten is a lost meal. That evolutionary quirk has produced a snake whose bite can, in some clinical reports, cause tissue necrosis and organ failure within hours. Estimates of the snake density on the island vary widely across sources, but the Brazilian Navy considers the risk sufficient that civilian visits have been effectively banned for years. Only a small number of researchers, accompanied by a physician carrying antivenom, are permitted to land. There are attractions in the tourism industry's own language that mean something. Then there is Snake Island, where the tourism industry has essentially agreed with the biologists that the risk is not something a 5-star review is going to fix. Elsewhere in the biological category is the elephant camp in Chonburi, Thailand, the one where, in a case that made international news, a captive elephant killed a Chinese tour guide and injured 2 other tourists during a routine encounter session. The camp was shut down, and the owner charged. What is unusual about that case is not that a captive elephant killed a person. Captive elephants have been killing handlers and visitors for as long as there has been an elephant tourism industry in Southeast Asia. What is unusual is that the incident was documented well enough, and in front of enough foreign witnesses, that Thai prosecutors could not simply let it be quietly settled at the local level. Every year, encounter attractions across the region injure or kill people, and most of those cases never leave the local district court. The next mechanism is chemical. In Ethiopia, the Danakil Desert, one of the lowest, hottest, and geologically most active landscapes on the planet, contains stretches of terrain where the ambient air is essentially unbreathable. The active volcanic vents around Erta Ale, the persistent lava lake in the northwest of the Afar region, release sulfur dioxide and other volcanic gases at concentrations that no unprotected human lung can process for more than a short interval. On the Hawaiian volcanoes, the same class of gases, collectively marketed as VOG for volcanic smog, have been publicly identified by the U.S. Geological Survey's Hawaiian Volcano Observatory as a growing risk to park visitors as Kilauea cycles through renewed activity. Crater edges collapse without warning. Particulates from glass-fine volcanic ejecta lodge in the lungs. And unlike a cliff, you cannot see any of this happening. You cannot back away from a smell. The mechanism is invisible until it is not. Then there is the last and in many ways most important mechanism, which is not physical at all. It is behavioral. It is the specific way that a person's judgment changes when they cross the threshold from home into a place that has been marketed to them as an experience. The Park Service in Yosemite has, in internal reports, been remarkably candid about this. Their fatality analysis notes that the majority of accidental deaths in the park involve visitors who ignored posted signage, went around barriers, or entered restricted areas, not because those visitors were stupid, and not because they were unaware of the rules, but because the psychological state of being on vacation, being in a photograph, being at the edge of a landscape that felt sacred and singular, overrode the ordinary risk aversion those same people would have exercised at home. The Park Service uses careful language for this. They call it a suspension of common sense. And they document it happening over and over at the same 3 or 4 viewpoints year after year. The fence is not the problem. The fence is almost never the problem. The problem is that a person standing on the wrong side of the fence has usually stopped believing, for a few seconds, that the fence was for them. To understand how these mechanisms combine in the real world, it helps to walk through a handful of specific cases in some detail, because the pattern only really becomes visible when you see it happening in individual bodies rather than in aggregate statistics. Start with Trolltunga. The Australian tourist who died there in 2015 was 24 years old. She had traveled from Sydney to the western fjords of Norway specifically to reach the rock, the flat, tongue-shaped slab of granite that projects horizontally out of the cliff face, 700 meters above the surface of the lake below. She was an experienced hiker. She reached the tongue in daylight, in reasonable weather, on a day when hundreds of other hikers were making the same crossing. What the coroner's report and later news coverage indicate is that she was standing near the tip of the formation, waiting her turn for a photograph, when she lost her footing. There was no guardrail. There has never been a guardrail. The Norwegian Tourism Authority argues, with some justification, that installing one would fundamentally destroy the visual character that draws people to Trolltunga in the first place. The whole reason the rock is famous is that it looks like a diving board into empty space, unobstructed by any human infrastructure. So the trade-off has been made, tacitly, by everyone involved. The rock stays uninstrumented, the visitors keep coming, and every so often somebody falls. Nobody in the industry says it in those terms. But that is the trade. Now consider the Chonburi elephant. Thailand's captive elephant tourism industry generates hundreds of millions of dollars a year and employs, directly and indirectly, tens of thousands of people. The Chinese tour guide who was killed in the Elephant Kingdom incident was leading a small group through what was marketed as a hands-on interaction. Video and photographs from the aftermath, which circulated on Chinese social media before Thai authorities could contain the story, showed the mahout in charge of the elephant losing control of the animal during the interaction. The elephant killed the guide in front of the tourists. 2 of the tourists were injured as they tried to move away. The camp was shut down, the operator and one of the mahouts were charged with reckless conduct causing death and injury, and for a period of weeks the entire Thai elephant tourism sector faced international scrutiny of a kind it had never previously received. Then the story faded. New camps opened. Old camps quietly reopened under different management. The underlying economics did not change because the underlying demand did not change. Which is a good moment to note this, if the specific pattern this episode is tracing, how the same accidents keep happening at the same locations under different management, why the regulatory response never quite catches up with incentive structure, is something you want to keep watching us investigate. Subscribe to the channel. The next investigation in this series is already being scripted, and it will follow the same method, publicly available facts, coroner records, and reporting, arranged into the story the industry itself never tells. Back to the cases. The Chinese tour guide who died at Victoria Falls in 2009, the one who opened this episode, was doing what his job description required, accompanying a client into a body of water that everyone involved in the tour understood was extraordinarily dangerous. The dry season current at Devil's Pool is manageable if you stay behind the rock lip. If you slip past it, no rescue is possible. That was public knowledge on the tour circuit long before that particular day. The tour operators kept running the excursions. So did every other operator on both banks of the Zambezi. In the years since, the trip has continued. The photographs from Devil's Pool have, if anything, become more common in social media feeds. There is no meaningful sense in which the tourism industry around the falls responded to the death by changing how the pool is run. What did was change slightly the language on the waivers. The El Caminito del Rey story is, in some ways, the counterexample to Chonburi and Trolltunga, a place where the death toll actually did produce a regulatory response. During the late 1990s and early 2000s, a series of accidents on the decaying original walkway killed at least 5 climbers and hikers. The regional government of Andalusia, facing lawsuits and mounting international press coverage, made a decision that most tourism bureaucracies do not make. It closed the attraction entirely. For roughly a decade, no legal access existed. The walkway was still there hanging in the gorge, and a stubborn subculture of climbers continued to visit illegally. Then, between roughly 2011 and 2015, a new walkway was engineered and built directly above the old one, with modern bolts, proper handrails, a helmet requirement, timed entry, and licensed guides. Since the reopening, on paper, the fatality count has stayed at or near 0. This is what a functional regulatory response looks like, and it required something the tourism industry almost never does voluntarily, an admission that the attraction, in its original form, could not be made safe. Compare that to the Kokoda and Black Cat tracks in Papua New Guinea. Both are historical wartime routes across some of the most punishing jungle terrain on Earth: river crossings, fallen trees, moss-covered rock ledges, cliffs, swamps. Trekking companies market both as spiritual pilgrimages, particularly for Australians whose grandfathers or great-grandfathers fought along the tracks in the Second World War. Australian veterans and modern trekkers who have completed both routes have publicly described the Black Cat as harder than the Kokoda. Fatalities on both tracks have occurred, and the isolation of the terrain means that evacuation from an accident site can take days. There is no equivalent of the Andalusian government intervention here. No consolidated regulator, no engineered safety infrastructure, no single body accountable when something goes wrong. The tracks run through terrain administered by multiple provincial governments in a country with limited emergency medical capacity. Trekkers sign a waiver, hire a guide, and go. Similar patterns hold for the Trift Bridge in the Swiss Alps, a suspension bridge originally built to service a hydroelectric plant beneath the retreating Trift Glacier, and now a paid tourist crossing 560 meters long, hanging 100 meters above the valley floor, for the Stairway to Heaven in Hawaii, formerly called the Haiku Stairs. Originally installed during the Second World War, so U.S. Navy personnel could reach a radio antenna at the summit, damaged by a storm in 2015 and repeatedly ordered closed since, and for the Heaven's Gate Stairway carved into Tianmen Mountain in China's Hunan province, a route of 999 steps that leads to a naturally formed arch in the rock. In each case, an infrastructure originally built for a specific working purpose has been converted into a paid experience, and each conversion has generated its own body of accident reports. Yosemite's Half Dome deserves a separate mention. The cables installed on the last 400 vertical feet of the ascent, so that hikers can pull themselves up the exposed granite dome, have been the site of repeated fatalities. The park's own long-term data suggests that most of those deaths cluster in wet conditions when the granite becomes slick and the cables give a false sense of security. The park has responded with a permit system which reduced crowding, but has resisted removing the cables entirely because the ascent without them would be a technical climb inaccessible to the general public. Which brings the trade-off back into focus. Every one of these attractions preserves its accessibility to ordinary tourists by preserving the exact features that make it lethal. Remove the danger and you remove the attraction. Everyone in the industry knows this. The question always is who pays the price for that trade. The current state of dangerous tourism regulation globally is best described as fragmented. There is no international body with authority over the industry. There are no cross-border reporting standards for tourism fatalities. Even the fatality numbers cited earlier in this episode, the Park Service figures, the Everest fatality rate, the death road death count, the visitor death totals for the major waterfalls, are gathered by different agencies in different countries using different definitions of what counts as a tourism-related fatality and are not systematically compared. A researcher trying to build a global map of dangerous attraction deaths has to reconstruct that map site by site, from national park incident logs, from Ministry of Tourism bulletins, from coroner records where those are publicly available, and in a growing number of cases, from press reporting that only surfaces because a fatality happened to involve a foreign national whose consulate got involved. There is no OSHA for adventure tourism. There is no aviation-style incident database that operators are legally required to file into. That gap has a consequence, which is that the industry's own risk management practices are almost entirely reputational. Operators who accumulate too many public incidents lose customers, get sued, and eventually close. Operators who accumulate incidents that do not become public keep operating. In practice, that means the pressure on any given attraction to become safer is proportional to how photogenic and shareable its accidents are, a system that is not really designed to save the people most at risk, which tend to be local guides, porters, and workers whose deaths do not travel through international media the way a tourist's does. There have been proposals over the years to change this. The mountaineering community has repeatedly called for stricter licensing on Everest expeditions, arguing that a fatality rate above 6% would trigger regulatory intervention in almost any other industry. The Nepalese government has resisted most of the proposed reforms because expedition permit fees are a significant source of national revenue, and because the Sherpa workforce that supports climbing operations is dependent on the season's income. In the American park system, the introduction of permit lotteries at the highest fatality attractions, Half Dome, Angel's Landing in Zion, the Wave in Arizona, has reduced crowding-related risk on some routes without addressing the underlying mechanisms of individual accidents. In Bolivia, the government constructed a new highway parallel to the Yungas Road, the so-called Death Road, in the mid-2000s, which pulled most through traffic away from the old route. The old road is now used almost exclusively as a mountain biking tourist attraction, marketed by dozens of La Paz operators, and while the annual fatality figure is far below what it was during the road's working peak, deaths still occur, most of them involving foreign cyclists. Insurance is the other quiet lever. Adventure travel insurance policies have, over the past 2 decades, become significantly more restrictive about what activities they cover and at what altitudes. Some policies exclude Mount Everest expeditions entirely. Some exclude any activity above 6,000 meters. Some exclude any hike listed on any published index of the world's most dangerous hikes, a category so broad that in practice it covers most of the attractions in this investigation. The result is a class of travelers who arrive at these attractions with no functional coverage, whose families, in the event of a fatality, are left to negotiate repatriation costs and legal fees directly with foreign governments and local operators. In more than one of the cases discussed in this episode, the actual cause of a family's long-term suffering was not the death itself, but the 6-figure logistical bill that followed. And still, year after year, the visitor numbers rise. Trolltunga now receives more visitors in a single week during peak season than it did in some entire years before Instagram existed. Devil's Pool has monthly waiting lists during the dry season. The Camino del Rey sells out its daily permits weeks in advance. Elephant camps across Thailand, including new operations in the Chonburi area, are open for business. The Ethiopian government has, in fits and starts, tried to develop Danakil into a broader tourism product. Everest expedition companies have shifted their marketing to emphasize commercial guided, a sense that require, on paper, minimal technical experience. The single most reliable predictor of a person's willingness to attempt one of these attractions turns out to be exposure to a photograph of somebody else who already did. Come back for a moment to the tour guide going into the water above Victoria Falls in September of 2009. He was, by all accounts, an experienced river guide. He knew the current at Devil's Pool, as well as anyone on the Zambian side of the river. He knew what happened past the rock lip. He went in anyway because a tourist he was responsible for had slipped, and because the entire structure of his job, the tour operator he worked for, the license he held, the tips he depended on, the professional identity he had built, was organized around the promise that when things went wrong, the guide was the person who fixed them. He acted on that promise. He was pulled over the edge. The tourist was pulled back to safety. Neither of them, before that afternoon, had done anything reckless. Both of them were inside an attraction that had been sold, licensed, and celebrated as an experience worth having. That is, in the end, the pattern this episode has been tracing. Is not a pattern of reckless tourists, though reckless tourists exist and account for a subset of the deaths. Is not a pattern of negligent operators, though negligent operators exist too. It is a pattern of an industry that has learned, over roughly the last century, to convert danger into a product, and to sell that product without ever quite admitting to the buyer what the product actually is. The wooden planks on Mount Hua are a religious artifact repurposed as a photograph opportunity. Devil's Pool is a hydrological accident repurposed as a swim. Trolltunga is a piece of Norwegian geology repurposed as a proof of concept for a certain kind of travel influencer identity. The Camino del Rey is a decayed service walkway repurposed as an adrenaline product. Snake Island is a naval-protected biological reserve that keeps appearing on lists that describe it as a bucket list attraction. In every case, the object is real. The story wrapped around the object is a marketing artifact. None of this is a case for closing these places. Adults are allowed to take risks. Mountains are allowed to be mountains. Rivers are allowed to be rivers. What is worth arguing about is the accuracy of the language the industry uses to describe what happens at these places. Because the current language, challenging, advanced, for experienced hikers only, an unforgettable experience, is doing something specific. It is transferring the risk from the operator, who is professionally aware of exactly how the deaths tend to occur, to the customer, who almost never is. And that transfer is the mechanism by which an attraction can kill several people every year and still, from the industry's point of view, be considered well-run. Water at speed, altitude, temperature, fauna, chemistry, behavior. Those are the 6 mechanisms this investigation began with. They have not changed in a century. What has changed is the number of people arriving to meet them. The families of the dead have been left to reconcile that arithmetic alone, one waiver at a time. If this investigation was worth your time, do the 3 things that keep a channel like this one alive. hit like. Subscribe if you want the next one to reach you. And leave a comment answering these. Do you think dangerous tourism operators should be legally required to publish their fatality statistics before selling a ticket, the way airlines publish incident data? Or would that just be an unfair pile-on for attractions where the risk is genuinely inherent to the terrain? Where does the responsibility actually sit, with the operator, with the government that licenses the operator, or with the tourist who reads the waiver and signs it anyway? And hardest of the three, is there any attraction in this episode that you have visited, or that you would still visit tomorrow if the opportunity came, knowing everything you now know about how the numbers actually look?